Good evening, ladies. Sorry about that. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Rock and Roll Union Podcast. My name is CT McManus. Glad you guys are with us. Over the next couple weeks, we're going to be previewing a show that we have up and coming starting in May. Our last show that we preview will be the week right before we go live with the second show. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce my guest co-host, who's actually going to be my co-host for Vinyl Siding, which goes live May 14th, Bill Puig. He's been with us here before. And I also wanted to touch base on our sponsor. You'll see it running along the bottom there, Rock Doc and Dental Rosenfeld Dental Associates, guys, located 1085 Inman Avenue in Edison, New Jersey. You can go rock your smile with the Rock Doc, David Rosenfeld. A lot of celebrities go to that office, guys. He just put up pictures of him with Black Label Society that had stopped in to say hi. But let them know that CT sent you or the Rock and Roll Union sent you, and they'll offer you some pretty good discounts. Guys, we are going to be sharing our views, our ideas, history, thoughts, all around the Beatles White Album tonight. Bill knows a lot more about the Beatles White Album than I do. I, as a fan, I know a good amount, but Bill seems to be I think Bill's got his PhD in that. So there it is. He's got the vinyl right in front of him, guys. So
this is not the vinyl. This is a reel-to-reel tape.
Wow.
This is called old school.
Yeah, man. So I see a heck of a collection behind you.
Oh, between records, tapes, CDs, I probably lost count somewhere around 3,000, I think.
Wow. And Bill, you're with Legion of Prague, Legion of Prague, right?
Yep.
And so Bill's more usually into prog rock, things like that. Believe it or not, the Beatles were. I mean, would you say that they were a good part of prog rock?
They definitely helped it get started. I wouldn't say that they were prog rock in terms of how we define it today so much. I mean, prog rock, as people call it now, has a lot of classical or jazz influence in it, odd time meters and so forth. The Beatles didn't do a ton of that, although they did occasionally, and there's in particular one song of the White Album where they really did it. But I think the Beatles, along with bands like the Beach Boys, Procol Harum, Zappa, Jimi Hendrix, they definitely paved the way for prog because they showed the people at the record companies that you didn't necessarily have to make something fit in a 3-minute single for people to go out and buy it. People would actually buy albums.
Yeah. The good old days. And I mean, as far as the significance of the White Album, I just want to give people a little bit of the background where we saw this in history, where the White Album kind of falls in. Now, the White Album is everybody calls it the White Album, but it's actually just the Beatles.
That's correct.
And this album goes in between Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour.
No, it doesn't actually. Magical Mystery Tour came first. It came out in December of '67, which is when the TV show Magical Mystery Tour aired on the BBC.
Gotcha.
The White Album came out in November of '68 and really was at an interesting time for the Beatles because the Beatles had some stuff they had to prove. Really, the story goes back to the end of the summer, August of '67, when the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, died of a drug overdose, accidental overdose. Epstein pretty much guided the Beatles throughout their early career. Very few business decisions were made without his say-so. And all of a sudden now he's gone. The one member of the Beatles that really was deep into the business at the time and wanting to try and be successful from a business perspective was Paul McCartney.
Right.
His first move was to get the Beatles on television to do a quote-unquote Christmas special, which became Magical Mystery Tour, which was a total mess. I mean, they expected that it would be done and aired in the space of a week. It took them over 9 weeks to shoot it.
Wow.
And when they aired it, people just didn't get it. It was just not terribly well received at all. And so, you know, McCartney recognized that there was an issue there, and that some regrouping was probably necessary in order to be able to get the Beatles back on track. They had an opportunity to regroup during the spring of '68. There was a famous trip that all four Beatles, along with various of their friends, took to India in that time frame to meditate with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who George Harrison had really latched onto the teachings of in a big way, and the other three decided that they would support George on this trip. And it was not just the Beatles that went. A lot of rather famous people at the time also went. Mike Love of the Beach Boys,
Wow.
who they knew was there. Donovan, the Scottish folk singer, was there. He was a good friend of the Beatles at the time. Um, Mia Farrow and her younger sister Prudence were there. Prudence got a song written about her, out of the Beatles.
Yeah, great tune.
Yeah, the trip to India was something of a watershed, and it changed things around in a very interesting way. And it came in also an interesting time because things in the Beatles' lives were changing. One of the things to, I guess, illustrate with that is when the Beatles went to India, John Lennon, although he had already met Yoko Ono a few months before, had gone to India with his wife Cynthia. Paul McCartney went with his girlfriend Jane Asher. Actually, she was his fiancée at that time. To illustrate how things changed so rapidly, within 2 months of the India trip, Cynthia had filed for divorce. John was already sleeping with Yoko. Paul broke up with Jane Asher. Jane found Paul in bed with another woman, and that was the end of that. By the time the White Album was done, one of the photographers on site at Abbey Road taking pictures of the events was Linda Eastman, who soon became Linda McCartney. And of course, Yoko was there throughout the sessions and had a fairly large influence on John's thinking really from then on.
Now, before this, they had a pact to not bring women into the studio. Am I right?
Correct. They basically didn't bring any extra people into the studio. They pretty much handled all their own instrumentation, multiple instruments with overdubs, whatever. That changed with the White Album too, with George Harrison making the decision to bring Eric Clapton into the studio, something that Eric was at the time rather apprehensive about. Nobody does sessions with the Beatles. He said, well, you are. It's my song. You're coming.
Now, there were so many things that went down during these recordings, like you brought up. Yoko coming in. This was the beginning of Yoko. I remember as I was trying to get some notes together and listening to the album, I had messaged you a couple of days ago and said, wait, is that Yoko singing there? And you were like, yeah, that was the debut of it. So a lot of things happened here. I know a lot of the Eastern or a lot of Western instruments were involved in this from that trip you were talking about.
Yep.
And so much. But talking about Mike Love and going into that a little bit, I'm going to bring up the first track off the album, Back in the USSR. And I was reading somewhere where Mike Love was like, it's good that you bring up the women. Keep pushing for the women in the USSR, which Paul and John wrote into the song. And I never knew that it was it was kind of like a satirical piece against Chuck Berry and the Beach Boys and other kind of American songs at the time.
Oh, it was definitely a nick on the Beach Boys. There's no question. And Mike Love actually encouraged it. He was, I think, the one who went to Paul McCartney and said, you could do like what we did in California Girls. You could talk about all the different regions of the USSR and how the women are from there. So that's where the lines about the Ukraine girls really knocked me out and stuff like that came from.
Man, I'm wondering if it's going to like bring its head about now with the whole situation going on in Russia and the Ukraine. And I know a lot of people are talking about it, but it's kind of funny to see where that moment in time was.
Well, it was a strange time in general, not just for the Beatles, but in the world. I mean, 1968, without getting too deep into all the history, I mean, we obviously were still in Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese had really it ratcheted up their offensives against the American soldiers in the region at that time. I mean, as a result of Vietnam being so hot and heavy, President Johnson declined to run for a second term and threw the election of '68 into turmoil. The Democratic Convention at '68 was just a total mess with demonstrations, police actions that took place against the demonstrators. And of course, Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated
Yeah.
throughout all of this too. So it was a very heavy time in the United States. I remember being a kid back then thinking, I'm going to get drafted and I'm going to run to Canada because there's no way in hell I'm going over there.
And I mean, this was the year before Woodstock, Charles Manson. I mean, this was a turbulent time. I mean, Vietnam going on, and just I couldn't imagine what that was like. But you had brought up something that I didn't know about the next song, Dear Prudence, that one of the people that went with them, that's where the song came from.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mia Farrow's sister Prudence was one of the people who went on the trip to India with the Maharishi, and she took it very, very seriously, apparently, to where she was meditating on her own in her tent every single day. And so, the opening line of the song from John Lennon, Dear Prudence, won't you come out to play? That apparently was something he actually said to her at one point. Aren't you going to come out of the tent and be part of the social gathering here?
Wow.
That song's interesting from another perspective too, because I mentioned Donovan was on the trip to India. Donovan had a fairly unique style of guitar finger picking that he used on a lot of his songs. He was very much a folky. Donovan's finger picking style found its way into quite a bit of the White Album. I mean, John Lennon uses it on Dear Prudence. There are a couple of songs where Paul McCartney uses it too.
Man, and then a little bit there, I was reading somewhere that the next track, Glass Onion, has some throwbacks to previous Beatles songs. And,
oh yeah. Yep. No, Glass Onion is actually, I think of it in terms of that it's I Am the Walrus Part 2. And what I mean by that is this. John Lennon wrote I Am the Walrus for the Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack a few months before. And he wrote it mostly because a fan of theirs, someone he met through the fan club, was asking John about the meanings of some of the lyrics he wrote. And apparently they were actually in some of the schools in England, in the high school system, they were doing analyses of the Beatles lyrics. And John Lennon was like, they have no freaking idea what it is I'm thinking about when I'm writing these lyrics. I'm going to write something they can't possibly analyze. and it became I Am the Walrus. Glass Onion extended it pretty much along the same lines, although he does reference some of the Beatles songs. He references, for example, The Fool on the Hill, which is kind of funny because he says, I told you about The Fool on the Hill. He didn't. That's Paul's song. And there are a couple of other references that get in there too. I Am the Walrus is in there also, and that one is actually kind of a sinister one. He makes the comment in the song, the walrus was Paul. Apparently there was some Eastern culture where the walrus was an animal that was associated with death.
Wow.
You might remember that back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was the whole Paul is dead conspiracy theory. And this was one of the things that fed it.
Now, was this, I'm trying to remember what song it was. I don't know if it was this one or another one off this album that they said when it played backwards, it said that Paul is dead.
That's I'm So Tired. That's on
That's right. That's right. We haven't gotten that far yet. After that, you had Obla Di, Obla Da. I could not imagine the the fun that radio DJs had trying to bring this song onto the air.
Oh, it's a fun song, but it's also one that's really written for laughs by Paul. I mean, Paul was, in some regards, a music hall guy at heart. His father, James McCartney, was a British music hall performer for many years, and Paul grew up with that. So to a certain degree, he enjoyed playing that style of music, and he just took it to town here. He mixed in some elements of ska. There's a famous lyric in there that, had he written it today, the song probably would have gotten banned, where he does the sexual reversal, where Desmond stays at home and does his pretty face.
Yeah. Yeah, it's talking about a different time completely. And then there's Wild Honey Pie after that, which is, man, how that, I believe that was another crazy tune.
Yeah.
Very short.
Wild Honey Pie, from what I remember, was written in India, and it was Paul McCartney basically being defiant. The Beatles, and for that matter, people were told when they came to the compound with the Maharishi, you're not supposed to do anything or bring anything with you that is, harkening back to everyday life in terms of what you do to make a living or anything like that. So of course the Beatles all brought guitars. And they did a lot of songwriting there. I mean, I think between the four of them, they wrote some 60 or some odd songs, a good number of which actually found their way onto the White Album. So Wild Honey Pie apparently was something that Paul McCartney threw together that he would play as they were walking from place to place, for meetings and so forth, just for want of a better way of putting it, to piss the Maharishi off.
Yeah. And then right into the continuing story of Bungalow Bill. What an interesting, like we talked briefly about the intro of Yoko Ono.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, to me, when I hear that song, it kind of grates on my nerves just a little bit, her voice in that song. But, and kind of knowing like what went on with Yoko and the whole band and everything. But it all starts there. Am I right?
It pretty much does there, and probably to a larger extent with Revolution 9 a little bit later in the album. Bungalow Bill is a story that came from India too, apparently. You had to apparently have a lot of money to afford going to visit with the Maharishi. And some of the people who came had a lot of money, but weren't particularly famous. And there was evidently one very wealthy American woman who came along with her son to sit with the Maharishi, who, by John Lennon's account, was a really obnoxious lady, and the son wasn't much better. The son got bored after about 4 or 5 days and said, "Oh, the hell with this. I'm going to go and link up with a safari and go shoot elephants." And that's where the concept of Bungalow Bill came from. Bungalow Bill is interesting for another reason, too, because of the person who was involved in production. Ordinarily, George Martin was the Beatles' producer. He obviously very, very famous for the work he did with them. The White Album sessions were somewhat stressful for a number of reasons that we'll definitely be talking about in the next few minutes, I'm sure. But in the middle of the sessions, George Martin decided he needed a break, and he went on holiday. And he told his assistant, "You're in charge for the next few days while I'm gone." His assistant at the time was a 20-year-old producer's assistant by the name of Chris Thomas. I don't know if you are familiar with his name, but Chris Thomas was involved during the 70s in producing some rather seminal albums. He did quite a few records with Procol Harum, with Roxy Music. Never Mind the Bugs, Here's the Sex Pistols was his.
Yeah.
The first two Pretenders albums were his. But here he is, 21 years old, and all of a sudden he's being told, "You're in charge of the Beatles." I'm sure that he was like, "Oh my God."
It's a good thing he didn't have a cell phone at the time. It would have been everywhere.
Yeah. Actually, with that song, one last thing about it. At the very beginning of Bungalow Bill, there's a flamenco guitar riff that is absolutely beautiful. I remember as a kid hearing that thinking, "Oh, wow, I didn't realize George was so good." It actually wasn't George playing that. It was Chris Thomas playing a sample on a mellotron.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that, to me, that's one of the fun things about the Beatles, and one of the things that I really enjoy is hearing a lot of the other instruments that you just don't hear anywhere else but Beatles music and the way that they used it. We have lost Bill. He'll be back with us. We're getting ready to go into a lot more of the album, guys. While we are waiting for Bill to recontact, there he is. Bear with us 1 minute. There we go.
All right. So, don't know what happened there. Sorry.
No worries. But going into one of my favorites on the album, Eric Clapton and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I know that there's a lot involved with this one, especially with the Eric Clapton thing, McCartney bringing him in. And what more could you tell us about that, Bill?
Well, it's just a beautiful song, first of all. I mean, back in these days with the Beatles, George Harrison wasn't given a whole lot of space to contribute songs. And with the White Album becoming a double album, which was actually something that George Martin didn't want to do, he wanted to make one really good single album and thought that some of the songs on the White Album, at least in his eyes, were filler. But because of the White Album having more space, George Harrison got 4 songs on the album, and you know, While My Guitar Gently Weeps is probably among the strongest that he had done with the Beatles at that point. I mean, it really signaled that he had arrived as a songwriter.
Yeah. Then into a really unique one. I don't know a whole lot about this song, but it's always intrigued me, and it's Happiness is a Warm Gun.
Yeah, Happiness is a Warm Gun is a John song. And that section of the song, it's really 4 different songs that are stitched together, 4 song fragments. But that particular fragment of the song, the last piece of it, he took from a gun magazine, where for hunters and so forth. Happiness is a Warm Gun was actually something that was in an advertisement in the mag. But the song is real interesting to me because it actually has a real prog rock flair to it, which is not really something the Beatles did. And what's really cool about it is, even though it was 4 songs that were written separately and then stitched together, it was played in the studio live as one. The Beatles actually did that as an ensemble in the studio in a single take.
Wow.
Which, I mean, George Martin and his engineers, they were the masters of doing individual takes and then stitching them together through crossfades and so forth. The Beatles clearly could have done that if they chose to. They elected not to on this one. They played it straight, and they did a wonderful job on it.
Wow. And then going back to what we talked about before, we have I'm So Tired, which is that, like you said, that track where they say if you play it backwards. I've never heard it. I've never honestly looked for it, but they say I'm so tired if you play it backwards. It says Paul is dead.
Yeah, no, that's the very end of the song. At the end, John Lennon is basically acting as if he's falling asleep. He's like, almost as if he's drooling over himself. And people suggest if you play that part of it backwards, they say, Paul is dead. Miss him. Miss him. It's a song that was pretty much a throwaway, but it's one that's remembered probably for all the wrong reasons because of that. You actually skipped over one.
Martha, My Dear. Yes, I did skip over Martha, My Dear. Let's go back to that. That's a good one, too. Another song that I don't really know a whole lot about.
It's a rather simple song in some ways. Paul McCartney wrote it about his dog. Martha was an English sheepdog. And it's one of these songs that just is made by the beautiful horn arrangement that's behind it. I mean, George Martin was a master at arranging strings and horns, and this song just really benefits from that. It's a wonderful sound to it.
And then I'm So Tired. And then next comes another one of my favorites that until later on in life, I didn't realize that it was written about Martin Luther King, was Blackbird. Great tune.
It is a wonderful tune. It is pretty much a Paul McCartney solo tune. I mean, he does the finger picking. That's another example of the Donovan style finger picking on that one. Interestingly, one of the things that's on that song also is a sample from EMI's tape library. You had the bird noises that go throughout the third verse. Were just taken as a sample from a tape that was on the library shelf. Paul McCartney used to apparently love playing with special effects and tape loops and things like that. And the ironic thing is on this album, Revolution 9, which is John and Yoko's experiment, is all about tape loops, and Paul McCartney absolutely hated it. He hated the fact that was on a Beatles record. Probably because of Yoko.
Yeah. Now the next tune, is there a whole lot to say about Piggies? I mean, that was a real short one.
Piggies is a Harrison song. It's George Harrison at his most sarcastic. I mean, it's some really nasty lyrics in that. Yeah, there's a lyric in there. Yeah, what they need is a damn good whacking, which for a Beatle to say "damn" on a record in 1968 was considered somewhat scandalous. And the final line of the record really kind of lays it home. Where they're clutching their forks and knives to eat the bacon. So the
Yeah.
piggies are eating their own, which apparently George felt capitalists did a lot of.
And then we went in from one animal to the next with Rocky Raccoon.
Well,
And
Rocky was the name of a cowboy, but although it certainly had an animal name.
So that was a really
Rocky was the name of a cowboy, although it certainly had an animal name.
So that was a really interesting. Sorry about that. That was a really interesting song, and that was a really interesting. Just wondering what you could tell us about Rocky Raccoon. I know it's one of those Beatles ones that a lot of people have talked about over the years. My parents loved this song, and it's a story.
Oh, it's absolutely a story. It's kind of based in the history of the Old West in terms of the style that McCartney uses on it. This is all Paul, obviously, on this one. It's a song that I think was largely done in one take. There's sections of the vocal where McCartney is actually chuckling under his breath. George Martin hated this one. I mean, this was one of the songs where he went public saying, "I would have gotten rid of that one if Paul had let me." It's not really a song that does him justice. But you're right. It was a song that, if you went to coffee houses or things of that nature back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was a song that you knew you were going to hear because it was easy to play. It was a Beatles song and people enjoyed it. People would sing along with it.
Now, Don't Pass Me By is the next one up. And what can we say about that one?
Don't Pass Me By is
notable. Really...
It's a notable song.
It hits
Sorry,
me.
go ahead.
Like, it hits me, and I really don't know like what to make of that song because like it gives me I don't want to say an uncomfortable feeling, but there's a definite feeling to this song.
Well, it's definitely a change of pace, in part because not only is Ringo singing it, he wrote it. It's the first songwriting credit he got as a Beatle. It's all Ringo. And he pretty much directed the session on it. He brought in the violinist who does the break at the end of the song with him. They're using a pump organ as the main instrument on there, so it's really more just the organ and drums and the violin on this. I mean, this is another example where there really isn't a whole lot of Beatle participation, but it's definitely unique to be sure.
The next one is another one of my favorites from this album, and it's got the same lyric throughout. It is "Why Don't We Do It in the Road." That really got me into thinking and looking at this album a little bit, as far as there seemed to be a big blues influence in parts of this album. This being one of those tracks.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting about it is this is blues oriented, as you said, but ordinarily the blues orientation of the Beatles music would come from John Lennon. This again is a McCartney song. It's one that was written in India. He wrote it apparently because he saw two monkeys having sex in the middle of a path that they were walking on, and it just struck him to write a quickie song about it. And it's a very short one. It's a little over a minute, and it's basically just piano and drums. There are a few songs on the White Album where Paul McCartney plays drums, and I would have thought, I did a little bit of research before we got on the show too. I had assumed that this was one where Paul had played drums instead of Ringo. Ringo's on this one. There are a few songs, and we talked a little bit about this before we went on air. There are a couple of songs of this album where Ringo is not playing, and Paul is playing instead. There was an incident during the recording of Back in the USSR where Paul and Ringo had it out. And I don't know what Paul said to Ringo, but Ringo, who's usually very easygoing, had just decided that he had enough. And he walked out of the studio and he was gone for 2.5 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. It was during this song.
It was not during this song, but it was during Back in the USSR. And Back in the USSR features Paul McCartney on
Wow.
drums as a result of that. It was, and they were really worried about that he might not come back. They apparently
I
kept
know
it very quiet.
I read certain places that they really had to convince him, like, to come back. Like you said, there were a lot of places that I read that he just wasn't coming back, and I don't know what it was that finally got him back, but thankfully he came back for the last little bit of the Beatles. I mean, you had 2 years after this, and then it was final complete. That was the time of the rooftop show 2 years later. But the last thing I want to say about Why Don't We Do It in the Road is I honestly had to look up who was doing the vocals on this, because I don't know if there was an effect on it or something, but like it didn't sound like normal Paul to me.
I don't know that they have effects on it as much as he was just very close to the microphone. I mean, he's clipping and distorting throughout it.
Yeah, yeah. So going into I Will, what can we say about that one?
That's Paul McCartney again at his best. I mean, this one, Blackbird is just a beautiful, ballad-like song with, again, the Donovan finger-picking technique is all through this one. It's a gorgeous song. Um, it again is a very short one. It's 1 minute and 40 seconds, but it is just exquisite the way it's done. There was one thing I wanted to mention, and I'm sorry for bouncing back and forth, but we're just doing this very quick. There was one thing I wanted to mention about Blackbird that is I always found interesting. The White Album came out in November of '68, right around the time that Crosby, Stills, and Nash had gotten together as a group in California. And Blackbird was a song that really took them by surprise, and they decided to do a version of it as a demo that they were using to try and get placed at a record company. And they do a wonderful 3-part harmony version of it, which has since been released. Atlantic put it out a number of years ago. But they sent it to all sorts of record companies, and one of the companies they sent it to was Apple. Graham Nash had recorded for EMI with the Hollies for quite a few years, so he had contacts at Abbey Road and so forth, and they sent it in thinking, oh, we could record with the Beatles. They got rejected.
Wow. Oh, man. Jeez. So our next song being, and I'm not even sure who the person was, but Julia.
Julia is John Lennon's song to honor both his mother and Yoko. And it's a really interesting song in a lot of ways. It's a gorgeous song, first of all. It was apparently the very last song that was recorded in the White Album sessions. But it was written when John realized that he wanted to marry Yoko, and he realized apparently that Yoko was filling a void that his mother, for a time in his life, had filled. And what? And you might know the story. John Lennon's mother was something of a party girl. She had abandoned him as a child, came back as he was a teenager when she could relate to him, and then got hit by a drunken driver and killed. So John Lennon always grieved for his mother and the fact that he was without her, and that he didn't have that influence in his life anymore. Yoko came along, and for all bad things we can say about Yoko and her talent or lack of it, one thing that Yoko did that was very important was she emboldened John to be himself and to take charge of his career. Up until the time of the White Album, when Yoko came along, for about 2 years, John had been very subdued. You probably remember there was a famous incident in 1966 where John made a comment to the British press saying, oh, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus now. He was so badly scolded, first by Brian Epstein and by EMI and by the British press, that he very much withdrew from interviews and things of that nature for a while. He just was kind of along for the ride. He would contribute, of course, on the musical side, but he didn't really get too much involved in the marketing or in interviews of that to support the band, anything like that. Yoko gave him the courage to take charge of his career back and to be more forceful in the studio and ultimately to leave the Beatles. He actually made the decision to leave the Beatles after Abbey Road was finished in August of '69. John and Yoko went on the first Plastic Ono Band tour in October, to go to the Toronto Music Festival. It wasn't until several months after that that Paul McCartney came out with his first solo album, and where John hadn't officially said that the Beatles were over, Paul did in order to market his album. John was really pissed at him for it because he said, I left first, and you didn't let me say about it, and now you're going and you're making all this big about that you're leaving the band. I left 6 months ago.
Yeah. And then after this one, there's not a year that goes by where I'm not singing this to Family's birthday. And I'll end up singing this more than the regular traditional happy birthday. But who were they celebrating? What were they celebrating at this time? What brought this song on?
There wasn't apparently any particular birthday that took place for this. It was just something that they cooked up in the studio, and Paul McCartney, I guess, had the original riff and came up with the line, you say it's your birthday, it's my birthday too. Lennon joined in. Lennon, I think, wrote the bridge. Yoko was in the studio at the time with John. Patty Boyd, George Harrison's wife, was in the studio visiting, so they're doing the backing vocals on it.
Oh, wow.
It was something that was done probably in an afternoon, off the cuff.
Then you have Your Blues. Looking at
there it is.
Yeah, man. And going back to that blues we were talking about. Any ideas behind this one?
Oh, John Lennon was definitely wanting to break out on his own with this one, and deliberately did a blues number that was sort of in the style of, the bands that were coming to the fore in England in that period. I mean, 1968 was a time when, of course, Eric Clapton's band Cream was very much in the public eye, playing the blues. John Mayall's Blues Breakers, Fleetwood Mac, Savoy Brown were all making records back then. This is probably Lennon's way of paying homage and also at the same time having a little bit of fun at their expense, coming up with some of the silly lyrics he did.
Now, the next one is something that I feel kind of harkens back to earlier Beatles tunes. I find it to be a little bit psychedelic, is Mother Nature's Son, and just some of the surrealism behind the lyrics.
Mother Nature's Son, as I remember the story, is largely Paul McCartney ripping off the words from a speech that the Maharishi had given in India. There's a significant amount of his teaching in that song, to be sure. Interestingly, and I'm not quite sure if this was planned this way, but there's 3 songs in a row on side 3 that are referencing the Maharishi in different ways. Mother Nature's Son is the first one, pretty much quoting him verbatim.
Wow.
Then the next one is Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. Everybody's got something to hide except me, apparently was a favorite statement from the Maharishi. He used to use it to try and draw people out, to tell them what was, basically say, you have to share what's on your mind. You have to share part of who you are with the rest of the group. Everybody's got something to hide except me. So he's trying to find, apparently, what they had to hide. And Lennon just took it to the next level and said, well, and my monkey, and wrote the song around that. Then, of course, there's the infamous Sexy Sadie.
Sexy Sadie, yeah.
Sexy Sadie is written directly about the Maharishi. The Beatles all left the Maharishi's camp early for various reasons. Ringo left first with his wife. They couldn't eat the food in India. They got sick, and so they went home. Then Paul McCartney left. He had some business to attend to after about the first week and a half or so, and so he went home, leaving George and John behind. George and John left after discovering that the Maharishi was apparently chasing after some of the women in the compound, including Prudence Farrow,
Wow.
and decided that they'd had enough of him. And John just decided he's a charlatan. We'll have nothing further to do with him. And so Sexy Sadie is written directly about the Maharishi, although obviously, because they didn't want to get sued, they didn't call him the Maharishi in the
Right.
lyrics.
Right.
They originally did. There is a version of the
Wow.
lyrics that I've seen quoted in one of the famous books about the Beatles as an author by the name of Mark Lewison, who back in the 80s when the Beatles music was being compiled for initial release on CD, Mark Lewison was given total access to everything at Abbey Road. And he apparently found some of the original lyrics to Sexy Sadie, where it was along the lines of Maharishi, who do you think you are? Who the fuck do you think you are?
Wow.
And it
Wow.
went downhill from there.
Man, they went that far with it. Man.
Oh yeah.
And then the next one is the Charles Manson theme song, Helter
Yes.
Skelter.
Helter Skelter.
And I mean, there's been so much said about this song, so much focus on this tune, mostly to do with Charles Manson. But where did this song originate? Any ideas? Like,
Well, in the first place, obviously there was nothing of Manson's thinking that had anything to do with this song.
yeah,
A Helter Skelter in England is a playground slide. It's a slide that a child would go to the top of, and the slide goes around a ladder that you use to climb to the top. So you're coming down in circles.
right.
That's a Helter Skelter. And
It
it's even referenced
says
in the
it in
lyrics. And going
yeah.
up, I go back to the top of the slide. Then I stop at a turn, go for a ride. I mean, so he's describing it. Paul McCartney apparently wrote the song because he wanted to get very heavy. He was tired of being called a lightweight by the press. Paul does all the ballads, Donald does all the serious stuff, is what they used to say. So Paul was reading apparently an article. There's an interview with Pete Townsend where he was talking about the Who's song "I Can See for Miles." Townsend was saying, "This is the heaviest thing that's ever been recorded," and Paul was like, "That sounds like a challenge to me. I bet I could out heavy that."
Wow, yeah.
And so Helter Skelter was 3-chord rock and roll, guitars turned up to 11, all sorts of distortion. Paul is playing the guitar on it. John is playing the bass on Helter Skelter.
And at this point, I don't remember too many songs with like that level of screaming that they did in this song. The reckless abandon that they had in this song, that they just kind of let everything go.
They pretty much did, and it was deliberate. I mean, Paul wanted to really make a statement with it, that he could do that type of music, and he did. That's, of course, the famous song that ends with Ringo throwing his drumsticks across the room and screaming, "I got blisters on my fingers!" Which actually, there's a interesting piece of trivia about that. The White Album was the first Beatles album in the United States to be released only in stereo. 1968, they were phasing mono albums out. In England, they had both mono and stereo versions of the White Album. The mono version of the White Album, you know how Helter Skelter has the fade out and then it fades back in to get to that last part with Ringo? It fades in the mono version in England, it fades out and stays faded out. It goes to the next song. They cut 45 seconds from it.
Wow. And then after that is Long, Long, Long.
George Harrison's song, beautiful one. It's one that probably doesn't get remembered to the degree that it should because Harrison's music really wasn't as emphasized by the record label back in the day. But it's just a very delicate, very pretty song to end side 3.
And then you had the beginning of side 4, the last side with Revolution 1. You got a couple of revolutions on this side. You got Revolution 1 that starts it.
Yeah, Revolution in some regards is the beginning of Revolution 9. The original cut for Revolution 1 that John Lennon did ran like 10 or 11 minutes. And they realized they couldn't do that and all on the record. They had to edit it off. So after about 4 minutes or so, they faded the song out. But Lennon decided there was stuff there that he wanted to keep. And part of that found its way into Revolution 9. the part of the story here, and it's not about the White Album per se, but certainly about the sessions, was there were no singles from the White Album, but there was a non-LP single and a famous one, "Hey Jude" with Revolution, was
Yeah.
done through the same sessions, and the fan.
Uh, we lost him again. I'm not sure what's going on, but he'll be with us shortly. Guys, thank you so much for watching the Rock and Roll Union streamcast. We got Bill coming back on right now. Sorry, Bill. I'm not sure what keeps happening.
Oh, it's probably on my side. I apologize. Yeah, I was.
No worries.
Yeah, I was just going to say we were talking about the Revolution single version. The fast version was done pretty much at the record company's insistence, and yeah, Lennon enjoyed doing it, but I think he enjoyed the experimentation with the slow versions and with Revolution 9 a lot more. I always thought that opening scream of the single of Revolution was one of the highlights of Lennon's career. It's just so perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I love the I love Paul's screams, man. I really do. And once again, going back to Helter Skelter, it was in there too. And there are just certain moments you can hear that. The next song we got up is Honey Pie.
Honey Pie is Paul McCartney doing his music hall style stuff again. It's a pretty song, but one that didn't get a whole lot of radio airplay simply because it was just very much old school style. That in some regards they did, I think, have a lot of fun with it. I mean, there's a section of it where they actually try to make it sound as if it's an old 78, yeah, with crackling noises and whatever. I wouldn't say it's my favorite song on the album, but I definitely can understand it, and they did a nice job with it for what it is.
An interesting one, the Savoy Truffle.
Savoy Truffle. Savoy Truffle is George Harrison's song he wrote for Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton loved eating candy, and he was in particular a fan of a particular style of candy that you could buy in box form at the store called, I think it was Macintosh's Good News. It's one of these where you bought the box full of candy and you took the lid off, and there was this diagram that showed if you take the one from this one, this one is cashew,
Gotcha.
this is filled with caramel, whatever. So the song is describing all the different types of candy in the candy box.
Huh. Like the Whitman sampler.
Exactly.
And then Cry Baby Cry.
Cry Baby Cry is John's song. This is one that I always thought was wonderful as a musician because of the use of dynamics. It's a fairly simple song in terms of its construction, but where it gets interesting is there are sections of it that are very soft, very delicate, and all of a sudden, heavy guitars, dong, bang! And it's just so striking and very memorable because of how they constructed it that way. I mean, this is another one where John Lennon just came up with a really good idea of how to construct a song really without having the song be terribly complicated, but he found ways to make the song interesting in spite of it.
And we're getting close to the end here. We got 2 songs left. We got a song that we've talked a little bit about already, Revolution 9.
Yeah, Revolution 9 is John, Yoko, George Harrison, and George Martin basically having an all-night session in the studio, basically playing whatever they felt like playing from pieces of Revolution 1, from the section that they edited off, plus other things they had recorded as test recordings, things from the EMI library that they faded in and out. It's just a collage of all sorts of weirdness. It's definitely influenced by Yoko in the sense that she was at heart a performance artist, and she was basically encouraging John and George to create on the fly, and that's pretty much what they did. Whether it's truly art, I'm sure is debatable. I mean, I know people who are massive Beatle fans who get to Revolution 9 and skip it every time. I also know others who think that it's really innovative.
What are your thoughts on it?
I listen to it when the record is on because I think the record feels awkward without it because I know it's supposed to be there.
Gotcha.
I can't say that I love it. I mean, after, I mean, it's 54 years ago now, and this is and things of this nature with sampling and so forth have been done by others and done better, I think, over the years to where it's not as important as it was. In 1968, I think it was important simply because nobody else would even have dared to try and put this on a record but the Beatles.
Yeah. I mean, it to me, I'm a big Deadhead, and I kind of liken this to Space when they play Space live, and it's just a bunch of, like you said, just randomness, whatever they felt like doing. And there's so many live albums that I hear from the Dead that I just skip past Space and drums, and it's a different experience if you're seeing something live, but. Yeah, I feel like you do with that one. And then we have our final song, which is Good Night.
Yeah, Good Night is a John Lennon tune, but he originally wrote it with the intent that it would be given to Ringo to sing, and that's what they did. Like a few of the other songs on the album, it really doesn't feature the entire band. I think John is playing acoustic guitar on it. There are no drums on it at all. The music is largely from a string section that George Martin brought in for the occasion, and then for Ringo to overdub his vocal after the fact. So it's definitely very different from the rest of the album in that regard. It's, you know, basically a child's lullaby, and in some regards is a fitting send-off to
Yeah.
the album. I mean,
Now, if you guys like what you're seeing, what you're hearing, this is basically what's going to be the meat and potatoes of what we're going to be doing with vinyl siding, guys. It's just going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking a lot more classic albums. This one we just kind of had to start with. We're doing our previews for the Rock and Roll Union show will be the greatest selling rock albums of all time. Now, this one, I believe, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 27 times platinum,
yep.
something in that ballpark.
Yeah, no, it's a double album, so that means they sold 13.5 million copies. But nevertheless, that's a hell of a lot of records.
Yeah. And it's just, there's so much music out there. And with the album basically being, the album's almost like a long gone art form at this point that me and Bill just kind of want to go back and pay attention to some of the amazing music that's out there. There's some bands that are still putting stuff out on vinyl, and I believe we'll do some of that, but we're kind of going back to the classics. So with Rock and Roll Union, with our preview show, you guys are going to see stuff like Led Zeppelin 4. We're going to be talking AC/DC Back in Black, Eagles' Greatest Hits. And then we're going to finish everything with Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. And that's going to be a really fun one because that's just an amazing. All these albums are amazing albums, but it just kills me. What are your thoughts, Bill, as far as like albums being almost like from yesteryear at this point?
Unfortunately, they really have become something of an artifact of a bygone era, and it's really such a shame because I remember as a kid going to the store and buying a new album, and it was almost as if it was an event to itself, not just because of the music being new and being something to take in, but the album artwork was so wonderful at the time. You had a canvas of 12 by 12 inches or 12 by 24 if you had a gatefold, where you could do some amazing artwork. And there were some artists out there, people like Roger Dean, who did most of the Yes albums of that period, the group from England, Hypnosis, Storm Thurgeson and Aubrey Powell, who did a lot of the Pink Floyd and Peter Gabriel stuff. They had such a unique and identifiable style that the artwork was just as important in some regards as the record inside the cover.
Yeah. And
on top of that, you got to learn a lot about the music and the industry by the credits, the liner notes that were provided and so forth. So you got to learn about people behind the scenes like the George Martins and Tom Dowds of the world, or someone like Alan Parsons, who worked on Dark Side of the Moon, who eventually became a pretty formidable artist in his own right.
Yeah. Yep. And it's just, this was a time when even producers, we talked about George Martin tonight. You talk about producers and directors and the people behind the scenes, and there were a lot of people that were involved in this amazing artwork. And now we have a digital era where a lot of people are making their albums in their basement or home studio or whatever the case might be. And it's kind of like stripped back a little bit because the band itself right now is handling everything. So they might not get that outside connection that maybe a producer or a manager or somebody coming in might hand them.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, speaking from my own band's experience, we have a 24-track machine in our studio, and we record a good portion of what we do. And I, and I love having that facility available because I think we can be, without a whole lot of effort and without a whole lot of um, money or time, we were able to put ourselves out there in the best possible light, and it's terrific. But at the same time, there is so much of it out there. There's so much music from so many different sources that it almost becomes a vast wasteland. You almost don't know where to start. And I'm sure there's some wonderful bands that just get lost in the shuffle as a result of it.
Yeah, I mean, we all came up when there was a time of bargain bins where you had the cassettes, the records, whatever in the bargain bin, and you could find something for $5. A lot of these bands that are out now, who knows, maybe they would have been put in the bargain bin, but every once in a while you get a gem out of that bargain bin.
Oh, and without a doubt. Without a doubt.
It's just, I feel like we've lost a lot of personality in music, a lot of personal connection. You talked about coming home and looking at the trifold and things along that line. I grew up in the 80s where it was cassettes were the thing at the time. But I remember when there would be a new band or a new cassette that came out, and you would run home, lay on your bed, pull out the notes and read the lyrics. We all knew all the lyrics because the lyrics were printed on the inside. Like,
yep.
It was just so much fun. And that's kind of like what we're hoping to kind of bring back to you guys. We're going to bring back a lot of those artists, a lot of those stories that you guys heard. Bill tonight, thank you, Bill. He was really versed in the Beatles and the White Album. There's going to be some albums coming up. One of my favorites is Back in Black. And with Bill being a Legion of Prague, which is a Prague tribute band, that's another fun aspect that we're going to be bringing into the mix. Is we're going to be bringing in tribute acts, and we're going to be bringing in people that definitely got connected with the music, because there's a million tribute bands out there now. There's bands that I never heard of that have tribute bands to them. There was one band that I saw was a acoustic tribute to Junkyard. Who would have known Junkyard would have had a tribute band, let alone an acoustic one? But we're going to be bringing these guys in, seeing what the music meant to them and what made them decide to kind of do what they do. And Bill's got his pick for his first one once we go live, as I do as well. And we're also going to be taking your choices, guys. If you have anything, if you're going to watch this in the replay, comment on the page as far as what albums you'd like to see us do. And make sure also, guys, I'd be remiss to say, please like and follow us on Facebook, on YouTube. There was a question, Bill, and I'm going to pose it to you. There was a question of whether or not we should have a separate page for vinyl siding. And I said, well, everything goes through Rock and Roll Union anyway, so I didn't really think to make a second page for people to comment on that. But maybe it's a good idea. What do you think, Bill?
I think it might be a little bit premature to do that. I think it might make sense for us to see what kind of reaction and volume of reaction we get.
I
If we
got you.
have a ton of people coming to the Rock and Roll Union page who really love what we're doing, then I think it might make sense to break it off into a separate page. But let's see where we go and see what kind of reaction we get.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if anything, it'll be two friends just talking about music, even if nobody's watching. We'll have a good time talking about what we're talking about. And Bill, any thoughts? Anything that you'd like to see coming up on what we're doing?
Well, you mentioned some of the previews that we're going to be doing over the next month, and some of those records are going to be a lot of fun to discuss. I mean, there's tons of information, tons of stories to tell about albums like Dark Side, about like Led Zeppelin 4, so forth. I mean, the famous ones uh, are so well documented that I think a lot of people could, after they've heard us talk through some of our impressions, they can go and find out a ton more if they choose to. So there's just a lot of rich information, a lot of wealth of information out there. But one of the things that I'm looking forward to with the show is finding out a little bit about bands or genres of music that, for whatever reason, I just haven't followed all that closely. I mean, you had mentioned off air that someone had come to you with requests for doing grunge albums. Now, I was obviously aware, and I listened to a lot of the big grunge bands in the early '90s, but I've grown away from it over the years because I've just gotten involved in other stuff and gotten to appreciate other stuff where there's just not as much space for it in my life. It's not to say that I don't like the music. I think some of that music is excellent, and having the opportunity to revisit some of it here, it'll be a treat, if nothing else, a treat for me because it'll give me the opportunity to go back and and re-experience it again for the first time in a few years and reevaluate it perhaps with a different frame of reference.
I'm looking forward to checking out some bands that maybe, like you said, maybe I missed the radar on. There's bands, believe it or not, that are out there that are uber famous that I don't really know a whole lot about. Bands like Motorhead. I know who they are. I know some of their songs, but I don't know them as well as some people do. Ronnie James Dio is another one. I don't know him as well as I'd like to. I have a few of his vinyl, and I know what he did. I know who he was, but there's a lot of his music that's out there that I don't really know.
His story is one that almost can't be done with just an album. You almost have to go over his career arc. I mean, Ronnie James Dio was making records in the early '60s. I mean, it's really rather amazing how long he was around doing all sorts of different styles of music in the hope of finally catching on and making it somewhere.
Yeah. And he did, man. And he's one of those heavy metal gods that, he's an icon.
Absolutely.
And there's probably a bunch of other bands out there. I know one of your favorites, Bill, that I don't know so much, but I'm looking forward to getting more into them is King Crimson.
Oh, yeah. King Crimson's an interesting band because the constant with King Crimson over the course of 50 years is change. I mean, they started with one lineup. By the time of their third album, it was a totally different lineup except for their guitar player. Robert Fripp, who was the guitarist, was the sole constant in that band over the course of his existence. And over the years, he showed that he was not always the easiest guy to get along with, but he was terribly innovative and a tremendous player. I mean, the album there are a couple of albums of theirs that I suspect we'll be discussing over the course, simply because they're such a great band and were so influential that even if they didn't always sell a whole lot of records, that they really can't be ignored.
There's some other stuff that I'd like to get into that is like borderline rock and roll. Maybe it's not a little bit outside the shade of rock and roll. Things like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Earth, Wind, and Fire and stuff like that I absolutely love. Some Motown stuff that I'm really into. Motown to me, yeah, I'm really ready to dig into some Motown, was a good foundation of rock and roll. There was so much rock
Oh
and
yeah.
roll, even though it was considered other things and still considered other things. Not to me, nothing beats Stevie Wonder or Aretha Franklin or some of those other artists that came out at that time period. Um, the Marvelettes, and I go back because I'm like, I always tell people I'm one of the youngest old guys, because my parents kind of brought me up that way. And I saw Chuck Berry live, and I saw the Shirelles and Fats Domino, and I was raised that way, the Beach Boys. And I'm looking forward to digging into some of that stuff as well, and maybe offering the viewers a little something that they might not know.
Yeah, there's so much going on with some of that music too. I mean, the music that was done, at Motown, and not just there. I mean, Motown was a huge success, obviously, with the backing bands they had there with the under Berry Gordy's and Smokey Robinson's leadership. But while they were doing their thing in Detroit, Atlantic was doing R&B in New York, Stax was doing R&B in Memphis, and they all had different approaches to it, which were wonderful and which had so many wonderful musicians come to the forefront as a result of it.
Yeah. And it's funny when you start looking at some of the background musicians that became famous, Jimi Hendrix being one of them,
Hmm.
that stepped out into the limelight and grabbed the mic themselves. And there is, I agree with you. There's just so many things and so much going on with music that it's going to be a lot of fun to go back and kind of talk the history of. So that about does it for us tonight, guys. If you, like I said, if you liked what we do, make sure you follow us, like us on Facebook and YouTube. And next week, we are going to be joined by Flying Circus. They are a Led Zeppelin tribute. They got a great show coming up next weekend at the Landis Theater. We're going to be reviewing Led Zeppelin 4. That's going to be a great show. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And really excited about this venture, my friend.
Oh, I am too. I'm glad to be part of it. Glad to have spent the time tonight, and I will be back with you on Tuesday next week. It'll be
Sounds
a lot of
good,
fun.
guys. Until next time, don't just leave it better. Have a good week, guys.
Take good care.